Here to speak with us is James Rogers, Director of Research at the Council on Geostrategy. James, welcome to the programme. You might have heard us trying to speak to Jerome there, who was just about to give us an update on the ground. But just going to the strategy of what's occurring at the moment from someone who understands military strategy, many Western officials have said that Russia's point of their invasion, or the focus of their invasion, is slow annihilation. What's your assessment on Russia's attack? And do you think, at first there was a lot of talk about how it wasn't going to plan, but it looks pretty dismal from where we're sitting.
Yeah, good to be with you. I think the Russian strategy is simply to decapitate the Ukrainian government. That's to say, to get rid of it. And I think they initially thought that they would be able to move into Ukraine very quickly, surround the two key cities, Kharkiv and Kiev, and force the government to fall from power. I think that their strategy was based on fundamental misunderstandings of the willingness of the Ukrainian people and government to fight, and also perhaps the realization of that government that this has to be for the long haul, insofar as Russia's objectives are to get rid of the Ukrainian government. I think the reason for that is very simple in terms of the Russian objective, and that is that it fears the emergence and development of democracy and a more liberal and open society in Ukraine, which could then be seen as an inspiration for the Russian people in potentially their willingness to resist the Putin regime in the Kremlin in Moscow.
And if it drags out, as it already appears to be doing in terms of the sort of Russian timeline, what impact does that have? And who does it impact most, Russia or Ukraine?
Well, I think the Russians now are going to move to a different type of strategy. The issue now is that they failed initially, and the regime in the Kremlin looks increasingly foolish because of its inability to secure its initial objectives in a very speedy fashion. I think now the Russians will move towards a more conventional form of their strategy, which we've seen in the past. They've used it, of course, in Syria and also in Chechnya, particularly against the city of Grozny, and they'll try to bring to bear the weight of their army and air force into the equation. This will involve the systematic destruction of Ukrainian cities and infrastructure, as they hope to bring to bear immense power to overwhelm and to ultimately decapitate the Ukrainian state and government. The people, of course, of Ukraine are going to suffer immensely, particularly in the built-up and urban areas. But I think as the West applies increasingly aggressive sanctions on Russia, that, of course, the Russian people are also going to suffer. And the objectives that the Putin regime had, both in relation to Ukraine, but also a speedy invasion to prevent the Russian people from suffering and potentially rising up against the Kremlin, will also fail.
But how would a decimated Ukraine, literally, and in a visual sense, which can't be kept from the Russian people forever, how would that play to Putin's narrative of them being one people and him loving Ukraine? If he's prepared to destroy it in the process of loving it, it's sort of mixed messaging.
Absolutely. But that's the point. The Russian narrative never makes a great deal of sense, and it's based on lies, disinformation, and exploiting the here and now. And I think it will become increasingly apparent that these narratives that have been projected by the regime in the Kremlin will be increasingly nonsensical, particularly, we've already seen this with the way that the Russians have dealt with the citizens of Kharkiv, a large number of those being, of course, Russian speakers. Now, eventually this information will get out and it will disseminate through Russia. And the regime will become increasingly, I think, desperate. And in its desperation, it will be prepared to do more and more brutal and bloody things. And in a way, it will become increasingly like, a rat trapped in a corner, snarling to survive.
So what, in that situation, what can we do? We sit here powerless to intervene. We watch Ukrainians, perform countless feats of incredible bravery, but are unable to respond in any tangible way. Military-wise, are we completely, disabled?
No, absolutely not. I think that we have seen increasing pressure applied by the West and assistance to the Ukrainian government. Now, the Ukrainian government, in order to survive, needs weapons, and it needs them in large numbers. The number of tanks, armor, and other forms of modern military equipment that the Russians will throw into the fight will grow. And the Ukrainians need the ability to push back, to resist, to buy time. And in that context, what the Ukrainians need are relatively light forms of weapons that can be quickly disseminated across the country and are not kept in large concentrations, because, of course, large concentrations of heavy weapons would then become increasingly vulnerable to the Russian Air Force as it's brought into the fight. So I think we've seen, and the UK actually here has been leading, attempts by the major powers in the West, the UK, Germany, Sweden, the US, to provide Poland, to provide Ukraine and the Ukrainian military with the kinds of equipment that they need to resist. Now, of course, the UK itself and other Western powers would find it very difficult to become directly involved in this conflict for the simple reason that Russia is a nuclear power. And if we become involved, it runs the risk of escalation to areas or into areas that we wouldn't want to even conceive of. So I think all we can do for the time being is to apply increasing financial penalties on the Putin regime and those that support it, and provide the Ukrainians with all the military equipment that they require and the financial assistance that they require to resist. Because it's only through resisting that they might be able to secure an advantage in the final instance when the political negotiations begin to leave this crisis or leave this conflict.
You mentioned air power, and Russia stupefied the West really by not deploying more of their fighter jets to engage in dogfights with Ukraine. Why do you think they've kept them at bay, and what do you think the next strategic plan will be from Russia?
Well, I think for the reasons I identified earlier, I think the Russians thought that this would be a relatively easy operation. They were not expecting the Ukrainian government to resist. They were not expecting the Ukrainian military to resist in the way that it has. And in some cases, it's been quite formidable. And I think that they held a lot of their firepower in the rear, thinking that they wouldn't actually need to use it. But I think as time has gone on, they've become increasingly aware that they will have to use it. And that will lead them into the situations that we were talking about earlier, where they'll have to deploy it against potentially civilians and cities in Ukraine, which of course is exactly what they didn't want to do. They wanted to arrive pretending to be liberators. But in fact, they're going to arrive being, occupiers, having subdued Ukraine using the brutal and blunt instruments of military force and in mass concentration fire. So I think they will bring their air force to bear as in the weeks ahead, and we will see increasing atrocities in Ukraine, particularly in the key cities, as they seek to take control of them.